And a great pleasure to welcome with us on the show today. Talk about a very interesting book about a very fascinating man, one of the legends of television. We're going to talk about Norman Lear, and it's a great new book called Norman Lear, His Life and Times. And the author, Tripp Whetsell, joins us today. He's a entertainment journalist, also a professor up at Emerson College. And right now he's in my hometown area of New York City. Joined us for a few minutes just to kind of talk about the book a bit. And Tripp, good to talk with you. How are you today?
Thank you, Doug. Thanks for having me on the show. Delighted to be here. I'm doing fine.
Yeah, I was happy to get the info from Jeff, who does the great PR for this book and so many others that we've had on our show. And I'm glad he's helping you out with this one because he's a good guy. But I had a chance to read.
Well, me too.
Yeah, great guy, and had a chance to read through the book. And Norman Lear, I grew up, I don't know what age you are, we won't have to say, but we're probably around the same age. I remember when All in the Family came on. He was the creator of that show. Of course, he had a great career in television before that, but I think most people probably associate Norman Lear with All in the Family, right?
No question. I mean, he did have a great career before in television. Before that, he was no rogue by any stretch of the imagination. He started off in the early days of live television working for many of the great variety shows like the Colgate Comedy Hour with Martin and Lewis. He was a writer on the George Gobel Show. He was a writer for Martha Raye. He did a lot of great films in the 1960s like Come Blow Your Horn with Frank Sinatra, Divorce American Style. But this was really, of course, when you say Norman Lear, he's known for these shows. And All in the Family, in particular, was his crowning achievement. I think, above and beyond everything else he did. I mean, and if he did nothing else, that would be enough. But that was his big, what he's, I think that was the piece of resistance, as they say.
Well, one thing about Norman Lear, most people don't really, unless you follow it real close, you're interested in show business. You don't really remember or know who the producers of shows are, but Norman Lear was one of those people in show business, not really on the camera hardly, unless he did interviews, but he's a producer that people knew about. He was a controversial kind of a guy, and of course his shows proved that, but the shows were successful, most of them anyway.
Well, that was, in that particular canon, he had about 6 shows on the air. When you talk about the Norman Lear shows in the 1970s, you talk about the Big Five, the Big Six, which were All in the Family, Sanford and Son, which was a second show that he and Bud Yorkin did, but it was not a direct spinoff of All in the Family.
Right.
Maude was the first direct spinoff of All in the Family. Then you had Good Times, the Jeffersons, One Day at a Time, and Mary Hartman. And yes, he was a very famous guy. He was really the first behind-the-scenes figure in television to become as famous as the shows he created, and he was able to, morph that into quite a sitcom machine throughout the 1960s. It wasn't that he was so much controversial character, because he wasn't a controversial guy, but his shows dealt with issues that had been previously considered too taboo for television.
Right.
So that is what, when you talk about controversy in Norman Lear, he was not a controversial guy at all, but his shows, pushed the envelope in a way that had never been done before, especially at that time.
Yeah, you watch some of the episodes of All in the Family, if you can find them now. I'm not sure that shows in syndication much, but you can see some episodes online, or I guess some of those streaming channels, and I got to say, probably you couldn't get away with some of that material today, right? That they got away with on that show.
Not at all, but it is actually, it's very much present, in reruns today. You can watch it on many of like Antenna TV. You can watch it on any number of his shows on these kind of retro TV channels like Catchy Comedy. There's a whole Norman Lear spate of shows every night. They do same thing with Cozy TV. They do that Antenna TV. So yes, you can definitely meet TV. You can definitely watch them in a way that you could. There was a period in the 1980s when a lot of these shows were not really shown on the air, but now they're shown, constantly. So you can definitely watch them on cable, and you can of course get them on streaming, and they're all available on DVD.
Right, yeah, you can buy them, and like you said, those streaming channels, which is a gold mine if you want to watch, great TV, and there's not a lot of it on now on the network, so that's where you go. But I guess All in the Family had early syndication success. I remember in New York they put them on right after, but not quite as much as maybe like the Honeymooners or those kind of shows. I guess it was a little controversial for that, but boy, that All in the Family it did not do well early, right? The first 13 episodes, but that summer it took off, didn't it? In the reruns.
Yes, it did. What happened was that he was, it swept the Emmys that year. He had a commitment from CBS for 13 original episodes and 13 repeats, and CBS did not want to air the first show, Meet the Bunkers, which was actually the pilot that he had done twice for ABC because he found it was too controversial. And he was adamant that he was not going to change a thing because, this is the first time, third time up at bat, and if they didn't like it, then they could love it. Basically, his position was that you have to get all wet at once, meaning you can't get wetter than wet, meaning that you have to deal with all of Archie's issues, all of Archie's vituperativeness. You have to just deal with all of it at one time, and it's lay everything threadbare, which they did in that first episode, even though CBS did not want to air that. Not only did CBS not want to air that first episode, but they had some changes for it. And then it was actually down to the wire, whether or not they were going to actually air that first episode. They wanted to air the second episode, which was called Writing the President, in which Archie Bunker gets dressed to the nine to write a phoning letter of praise to Richard Nixon.
Yeah,
but they didn't. They ended up doing and Norman was prepared to walk, but he didn't because they did what he wanted to do, and then they kept shooting the flames higher and higher and higher throughout that first season, and eventually he was able to do more and more stuff, and the show took off. After it swept the Emmys that year, it won the Emmy for Best New Show, and also Best Actress went to Jean Stapleton that year, and it took off like a rocket after that.
It became part of that tremendous lineup on CBS on Saturdays, which I believe began with All in the Family. You also had Mary Tyler Moore, eventually Bob Newhart, and then Carol Burnett's show. Other shows were in there as well, MASH, I believe, but
yes.
Tremendous lineup.
Well, yeah, but those were the golden years, and that was thanks to Fred Silverman, who was the young programming wizard at the time, who championed All in the Family and really believed in it getting on the air. And once the show took off on Friday night, once the show got really hot again after the first year, there was a question of what to really do with it, because it originally was airing on a Tuesday night at a languishing time slot,
right.
And they didn't want to put it on Monday night because of Monday Night Football was not.
Right.
Yeah. So Fred Silverman, who went on to become the president of all three networks, was very adamant about getting it on to Saturday night, and this was a brilliant move on his part. With All in the Family in the lead in, and then you had Mary Tyler Moore, MASH, the Bob Newhart show, and Carol Burnett show, and that is again still remembered as the best night in television ever. And of course, back then we didn't have DVD players, we didn't have streaming, we didn't even have VCRs or Betamaxes yet, which probably many of you listeners don't even know what they are because they're so old. But they didn't even have those yet. So what you saw is what you got, and there was no do-over. If you weren't there to watch it the first time, you couldn't watch it again.
Right. You had to wait till the summer and maybe see a rerun, but right.
Right.
Well, I think you talk about it. I know you talk about it in the book. Lucille Ball, which was still on Monday nights, I believe, when All in the Family came on. She was not a big fan of the show, right? That was another contention, wasn't it, to have it on Monday nights?
She was not at all. I mean, she at that point was in the sort of the twilight of her her career. She had her third sitcom, Here's Lucy, which co-starred her two kids, Desi Arnaz Jr. and
right.
Lucy Arnaz, playing her real-life kids on the show. And she thought that this was supposed to be, she's like, what is this show doing on my network? She thought that, she didn't think it was a great show at all. And, sitcoms, from her vantage point, sitcoms shouldn't be like this. Sitcoms should just be fun and whimsical. So this was a very difficult thing for her to see.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, let's talk a little bit about Norman Lear. Of course, he had a great life. I mean, he made it to over 100 years old before he passed away not too long ago, about a year or so ago. And now, I know you did some research into him. He had kind of a tough life, a bit of a difficult family life growing up, didn't he?
He did have a difficult family life. His father went to prison when he was 9 years old for selling fake securities, and it was very, he had a very difficult childhood. He was shuttled around from relative to relative, and he also grew up with the Great Depression, and he dealt with anti-Semitism. He was a young boy who was Jewish in the 1930s, so it was not. He didn't have an easy childhood. I mean, it wasn't. He wasn't abused, or he wasn't. But it was not an easy childhood, though.
Well, didn't he kind of base Archie a bit on his father?
Well, a lot of the traits reminded him of him. What really the catalyst for him buying the rights to what had been the predecessor, if you will, All in the Family. It wasn't really a predecessor because they were doing totally different things. But Till Death Us Do Part, which was the British series that had been founded by Alf Garnett, Norman was so taken aback when he read about it, with the relationships there, that it reminded him of a lot of his relationship with his father. His father, Herman, often called Norman the laziest white kid he'd ever met, and stuff like that. And he would refer to Norman's mother as Dingbat and tell her to stifle. So, yeah.
And Meathead, Rob Reiner's part, a little bit based on himself, right? I mean, he was a liberal guy in the show, and Norman Lear, of course, a very liberal guy, right?
Well, yeah, and of course, Rob and Norman knew each other since Rob was a young boy. He and Carl Reiner, Norman and Carl Reiner were, of course, very good friends, and they used to vacation together at Fire Island. They had summer homes there. Norman's oldest daughter, Ellen, used to play jacks with Rob Reiner, and Norman remembered, sort of realizing he was funny because the way he played jacks with Ellen, he thought there was something kind of funny about this kid. Norman thought that, and he was sort of the first to point that out to Carl, and Carl didn't see that because parents, frequently don't see the same thing that other people see in their kids.
Right.
And this was the case there. And he was very good, but when it came time to casting the role of All in the Family originally, he did not think that Rob Reiner he thought he was too young for this part. He had been a hippie played a lot of hippie roles, and then, oddly enough, in these, kind of cartoonish hippie characters. But John Rich, who was the director, would often cast him on shows like Gomer Pyle USMC, right, and a number of other shows like that. Rob had also written with Steve Martin the last year of the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour on CBS. Right. But Norman, again, when he was casting All in the Family for the original pilot, didn't think Rob was kind of quite right for it. I thought he was too young. But he later appeared on a short-lived CBS series called The Headmaster, which was one of Andy Griffith's shows, many flops in between the Andy Griffith show and Matlock, in which he played a headmaster. And it was a drama show in the early 1970s, and Rob played as a teacher who had an affair with one of the students, and that cinched the deal for Norman. Norman saw the performance. He looked at him through a different lens.
Yeah, and of course that cast was just perfectly cast. Of course, Sally Struthers as well. You mentioned Gene Stapleton, and
yes,
and of course Carol O'Connor. And you mentioned before, the 6 shows that people associate with, the 6 hit shows. I don't know if he invented the spinoff. I guess there were spinoffs before that in the 60s, but he really made it, I think, something special because one of the great spinoffs from All in the Family was Maude, and I believe Maude was based heavily on Norman Lear's wife at the time, right?
Well, she was based on it. I mean, yes, correct. To answer the first part of your question, there were many spinoffs, of other shows. Norman did not, invent the spinoff.
No.
Getting back to the Andy Griffith show for a second. I mean, that was spun off from the Danny Thomas show,
right.
Make Room for Daddy, so there was a multitude of spin-offs. The Honeymooners was spun off from the Jackie Gleason show. But Maude was a one-shot deal. After the first season of All in the Family, Norman wanted someone who could just come in there and just slay Archie. Just give it to him, just lay him out. And he came up with a storyline about cousin Maude, Edith's liberal cousin from upstate New York, coming to take care of the family when they all had the flu. And so she shows up on the bunker's doorstep and ends up doing this, and was ahead. B. Arthur, Norman and B. Arthur had been good friends for many years before that. And he showed up on the doorstep and did this on the show, and that's how that kind of all transpired. And when B. Arthur showed up and it was so successful that when Fred Silverman saw it, even before the episode finished airing, he said, we got to put that woman in a show of her own. So hence Maude was born, but she did not want to do Maude because she was really, she was a young woman raising a family. She was living in New York at the time. She just really didn't want to make the leap. But her husband, Gene Saks, who's a very famous film producer at the time, director, did a lot of Neil Simon films, such as Prisoner of Second Avenue, a great number of films. They were married. He was in LA a lot doing films, so that sort of transpired over to that.
Yeah, one of the most successful spin-offs, probably of all time. And of course, B. Arthur went on to win, I guess, many awards for that show. And I saw a couple interviews with her. Those historical interviews on YouTube you can watch. Very unlike the character she played, I guess, is Carol O'Connor. Very unlike Archie, right? But I mean, that proves how good actors and actresses were.
I think that. Well, first of all, she only won one Emmy award throughout the whole show. The show was nominated several times, but they didn't win. I think they only won one time.
Is that right? Okay. I thought they won more.
Yeah, and there was an incident at a black tie dinner for Norman and Bud York, when Bill Macy dropped his pants, which he was always loved to do. He had been in the Broadway play, off-Broadway play Old Calcutta, which had full frontal nudity in it. And if you look at he loved to drop his pants. It was just one of his things, and you saw him doing that a lot of times in Billy Season's The Maude. So it almost got them banned from the Emmy Awards altogether. But she did win one award. And she was actually very much a feminist. I think she was a lot like the character in many respects. A very brassy, sassy woman. Carol O'Connor, conversely, was not like Archie Bunker. He was a liberal, and I think it was a very big responsibility for him. And he felt like he was carrying the shoulders of the weight of the world on his shoulders, and it was very hard. It really contributed a great deal to the creative tension between Norman and Carol.
Yeah, they kind of butted heads, right? Carol O'Connor and Norman Lear throughout that whole show.
They did butt heads quite a bit. They did butt heads quite a bit. I mean, Norman, as Norman said, Norman loved Carol O'Connor, and he was in awe of his talent. He said there would never have been another Archie Bunker. He was the only person who could do it, and he embodied that role with his entire being. But Carol O'Connor, went to every script, sort of clenched fist. Every table reading. He didn't like a lot of what was on. He didn't like a lot of the material in the scripts. And he would also, he would frequently clash with Norman over the littlest thing. He wrote the entire, premiere episode that completely rewrote it. He didn't like it, the first episode. And it was practically all the better, the product, what was produced. But yes.
Yeah.
There were a lot of clashes there.
Despite that, of course, they came out with some classic episodes, and we won't keep you much longer, Tripp. I love talking to show business and television, but
likewise.
Did you have a chance?
This is great.
Did you have a chance at all to talk to Norman in his later years before he passed?
I did. He was unable to participate in the book, unfortunately, for a variety of reasons. So I wasn't able to get him for the book, but I interviewed him for the 40th anniversary of TV Guide in 2002, which was great, and he was a lovely guy. Sent me a letter to tell me how much he enjoyed the article. I interviewed him again for my last book on the improv when I was in New York just to talk about the comedy scene in LA. And I also interviewed him. He did my class at Emerson a couple of times on Zoom because he's an alum of the college, and we have a scholarship in his name, and we have a campus, and we have a thing on the campus of a statue of him on the campus. So he was great.
Speaking of Emerson, I had a chance to talk with the great Bill Dana several years ago. Of course, another Emerson alum. Did you ever have a chance to work with him? Yeah, great guy.
Never did. He was on my bucket list. I'm sorry I never got to do it because I was a big fan of his, obviously. Yeah. And he was wonderful alum, and he created our comedy archives, which are like just a treasure trove, like the Television Academy of Arts and Sciences Oral History Collection. You can listen to any oral history with virtually any major television star. Many of them are gone now, unfortunately, and it's just a treasure trove.
Of course, he wrote the famous Sammy Davis Jr. episode of All in the Family.
He wrote this, Jose Jimenez, of course, was his famous character, but he did the Sammy Davis Jr. episode. Yeah, it was a very interesting thing. He and Norman knew each other for years. I don't know that they knew. I don't think they knew each other in Emerson, and they were certainly contemporaries. But he was, it was always the hottest show on the air. And Sammy Davis was chomping at the bit for years to get on All in the Family. And he and Norman had known each other back since the 50s, since Norman had worked for Martin and Lewis on the Great Comedy Hour. Sammy Davis loved the show so much that All in the Family that he used to put off his rehearsals in Las Vegas for an hour on Saturday nights just so he could watch All in the Family in his dressing room. And he would always go. Would do this major campaign on Saturday, to go on the Tonight Show and say, this is a great show, but I'd be so great on this show. He was calling Norman constantly to say, let me be on the show and things like that. And he said, Norman was like, no, we don't do guest appearances. But they finally came up, and then Bill Dana was also as good friends as they were. He was trying to get the bit to write for All in the Family because this was obviously the hottest show in the country at the time. And Norman said possibly, but it's not really likely. So, but if you can come up with a plausible idea for the Sammy Davis Jr. episode, then we'll think about it. So Bill Dana came up with this idea of Archie moonlighting as a cab driver and Sammy Davis leaving their briefcase in the cab and stopping at the Bunker's house on the way to JFK Airport to fly back to Los Angeles. And that was a plausible idea, and out of that, Archie became a cab driver. To set up that storyline, John Rich they created that trope several weeks before, to have Archie driving a cab several weeks before this happened.
Right. Yeah, great episode, and of course the classic closing scene in that. Nobody will forget it if you ever saw it. So
the kiss, yes,
the kiss. Well, it's a great book, and we just touched on just a few of the stories in it. It is called Norman Lear, His Life and Times, really one of the great icons of television and, of course, television comedy. And Tripp Whetsell has been our guest today. And Tripp, do you have a specific website? I know it's probably available everywhere, but direct people to the book.
Well, it is. The book just came out yesterday, but my website is normanlearbio.com. NORMANLEAR bio.com, and you can buy it there. You can buy it from Amazon. You can buy it from Barnes & Noble, and it's in most major retailers. So, yes.
Great. And Tripp, real pleasure to talk to you. Hopefully we can do it again. Do you have another one in the works now in the entertainment vein?
I've got some things, some ideas that I'm canoodling with. I've got some ghostwriting projects, and I'm teaching and doing a few things, but nothing imminent yet. But I've got a few things few ideas that are percolating, yes.
Yeah, I know the previous we just talked before we went on about the Improv, great comedy club, so that was a fascinating book as well. But please keep in touch through Jeff, and we'll love to have you on at that time. But in the meantime, get Norman Lear, His Life and Times. And Tripp, thanks for talking with us today. Pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. That was fabulous. I appreciate it.